All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sepio's Fireside Chat. I'm sitting here with Chris Hart, Director of Cyber Services at CyLumena. Chris, thank you for taking the time today.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
So, and being our first face-to-face interview in our new offices, given the challenges of today, I really appreciate you coming in today. And we've taken all the proper COVID precautions. So again, I thank you for being here. So Chris, today, we decided that we want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing the pharmaceutical industry, and especially around COVID-19 and the work from home. But before we do that, can you tell me a little bit about your role at CyLumena and a little bit about what CyLumena does?
Sure. Well, this is my first role in as a non-CISO or a non-in-house cyber guy. My responsibilities at CyLumena are really to look at the market, figure out what solutions and services make sense for our target market, which is largely small and mid-sized organizations, and then facilitate them having access to that technology. Our business model really is aligned around a concierge type of service where we bring enterprise types of solutions and make them accessible to those small and mid-sized organizations.
Perfect. Given your past experience, before CyLumena, I know that you kind of worked with some of the pharma industries. Can you tell me a little bit about that and
Sure,
kind of that history?
Sure. Although I started my CISO career in networking technology with Hughes Network Systems, I then went to Invitrogen, who with the acquisition of Applied Biosystems became Life Technologies, and then we were subsequently purchased by Thermo Fisher Scientific. At Thermo Fisher, I was responsible for the cyber side of the cyber and risk office. Was a cyber CTO and deputy CISO. Before that, I owned both the cybersecurity risk and compliance organization.
Great. Well, that should behoove us well for this conversation today, that as we focus on the pharmaceutical industry. So, given the current state of things, both the importance of pharmaceutical companies and the role they're playing, and then also the challenges around COVID, what are some of the security risks you see particularly that may be a little bit more different to pharma?
The pharma space, and I like to kind of bunch pharma and life sciences and the biotechs. Although they are a little different, I think they're all kind of there in the same vein. They really are an interesting animal. They're not unique, but they are special in that when you think of the traditional confidentiality and integrity availability triad, all three are critical. Right. in pharma. The manufacturing side needs really consistent manufacturing processes, methodologies. That integrity is absolutely critical. On the research and development side, with the pipelines that sometimes can span decades, confidentiality is certainly a premium. And as you're distributing products that are life-saving by nature, those solutions must be available. So it creates an environment where the traditional concepts of cyber go from being important to being very important. Concepts like understanding what's going on your network, understanding the different layers of your environment so that you can have a real defense in depth. These things they're blocking and tackling in some circles, but in pharma and the life sciences, they are absolutely critical. Adversaries can be all over the map, so you really have to be ready for things coming from anywhere.
So that would include not just your traditional IT environment, but IT, IoT, OT, as we see different responsibilities coming together?
Yeah, absolutely. The cyber organization is traditionally being part of IT. Mm-hmm. As you go up that maturity and that sophistication ladder, that model breaks down. You have to become part of the business.
Right.
Your job is not to just provide security services or cyber services for IT. You need to be integrated on the business side with the organizations running your GXP processes around manufacturing or your laboratory space. You need to protect laboratory notebooks the same way you protect your core backend data services. So it really becomes, you become a business partner instead of an ancillary service. to IT.
Understood, and absolutely, I can see how difficult that could get, especially the rapid speed that we see now that the companies are under.
Absolutely.
Any certain trends of attacks that you've seen within this security space right now? What do you see that's maybe a little bit different than we saw 12 months ago?
There's always the organic maturation of what some of our adversaries are doing, be it nation states around harvesting very important intellectual property. I mean, most think tanks will tell you that two big targets, or two of the larger targets, are aerospace and biotech, pharma, and life sciences. That's where nation states are looking to make that long-term, long-play investment in harvesting your intellectual property. Beyond that, you've got the cyber criminals who are looking to get identities to sell in the black market, or credit card numbers, or in some cases, just being disruptive from a hacktivism perspective, or what we're seeing so much more of now, and a maturation around ransomware. Ransomware as a service is a commoditized black market service now. That you don't need sophistication anymore to leverage those technologies. They're there as an underground service.
That's a great segue into the next question. It really comes into to hardware attacks. Given work from home, especially the increase of work from home, given COVID-19, and really kind of a disbursement of the workforce, where traditionally in a pharma industry, you tend to work in a centralized location, and the brain trust stays there. And now, unfortunately, it needs to be spread out. What additional risks do you see, especially at that hardware layer, that layer 1, layer 2 threat level within companies?
Yeah, before pharma became as workforce decentralized as it is now, you're right, things were enclaved, and a lot of organizations really took the approach of the egg philosophy around, or the egg approach to information security, where you have a nice crunchy layer that's really strong and really controlled and really really hardened, but then the middle is very soft and gooey. And that was the approach. That the attempt is you need that security, but you also need that flexibility for your R&D community. And that breaks down in environments like we're seeing now, with things being so decentralized. Now, the good thing is that defense in depth model it's been preached for how long? It's one of those tenet concepts that a lot of people take for granted. Well, a lot of institutions were already going down the road of decentralized computing with cloud technologies, with Office 365, with AWS, and with a mobile workforce to leverage not only the costs associated with the centralized workforce, but also to gain talent that they may not otherwise have access to. So that, for a lot of organizations, and even a lot of pharma, that's the direction they were already going. And what's happened since February and March has really been an acceleration. So those organizations are faring very, very well.
Understood.
A lot of organizations weren't. A lot of organizations have taken that firm and crunchy approach, where they don't really know what's in their network. They don't know. They understand what's coming in and out, but as far as what's really happening in there, they just don't know. And it's not necessarily their fault. It's the way they've developed, and it's a model that we're seeing change. COVID has just kind of helped that along the way.
Got it. Understood. And when you kind of look at that, I think that a lot of companies, when we've talked to CISOs, nobody could have been prepared for the situation we're in, right? And the hardware asset piece of it, even to be able to supply their employees now that had to work from home, and they were forced to kind of break protocol or bend protocols, the way you kind of like to say it, and being able to be flexible, of allowing people to use devices that may not have been vetted, or multiple devices they would never have seen on their network. How important is that piece to be able to at least have visibility into all those things that are coming in your network that you didn't have, normally you would have never let inside your network, or didn't have control in the past?
Yeah, it's becoming critical, and you do see a lot of organizations are now starting to prepare for that. There's a number of organizations that I've dealt with that their approach early on, there's no way they could have deployed over the course of 2 weeks,
Right.
8 or 9,000 new laptops.
Right.
It just wasn't tenable. The business has to keep moving. So the approach that was decided on was, okay, well, these employees are going to expense their own computers, and we're just going to have to clean up later.
Right.
Which perfectly viable approach, but now we have to protect those devices as they begin to matriculate back into the corporate network, or as they become more trusted, to be able to do things more than just, okay, you can access the Office 365 suites, but you can't get access to the back-end R&D materials. You need to come into the office, or you need some other mechanism to do that. So it's soon going to be time to hopefully, it's going to be soon time to pay up for those investments and start making those things happen, because companies have an enormous number of machines that they don't know what they're on, because they were purchased and expensed, because the business has to keep running.
I want to come back to a little bit later, that piece of what happens when those employees, we eventually start coming out of this, and they'll never be what the new normal looks like. But as employees are coming back into the fold and back into the network, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But you've been around, you've seen the security youngin that we've, and security experts have been pushing for the last 20 years in a different layered approach. What to you made Sepio interesting? And with that, what challenges did you see the HackOne solution from Sepio providing that you were not getting in your current stack, your current solutions?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's really two components. And a year ago, over a year ago, I guess, when I first learned of the Sepio solution and what it could bring, it was really articulated as a rogue device detection solution. And I think it's a tremendous solution for that. I think for organizations like a lot of the biotechs who have a huge investment in their R&D, that really need to make sure that as many angles as possible are covered, I think it's a tremendous addition to that traditional IDS, IPS content type of stack. I think that there's a secondary benefit that really resonated even more for me, especially with most of my customers, which are the kind of the sub $2 billion, the $1 billion sweet spot of kind of the mid-market, and even lower into smaller organizations, is the nature of the technology lends itself to being able to know what's on your network, irrespective of what it is. That to me is huge, because in my world, I kind of break things down in high-tech organizations into, there's kind of 3 core tenets. You need to understand what's on your network. You need to understand how things are done on your network. And this means not only understanding your business processes and the way that you go to market with those solutions, but how they're developed and how they're created and how they're supported. And then you need to understand your adversaries. And that component of understanding what's on your network is probably the weakest when it comes to the small and mid-market. And that's where I think even though it's not necessarily the most glamorous and sexy approach to your product, because your product will do some really neat stuff, it's one of those that lends to that blocking and tackling that I think is a huge win for small and mid-market.
That's great to hear. We've talked a lot about the hardware piece of it, from Sepio and that visibility, that we give. But, if you look in the past, so much time and money, especially money and resources, has been spent on the hardware piece. On the application security piece and the network security piece. Why do you think that was in the past, and why do you think that that's not enough? I mean, Sepio, we have our marketing piece and we talk about the 3 buckets, but where do you think that leaves a gap within companies that really have, understanding you spent the money, whether it be a mid-tier company or some of the largest pharmas out there, on that application and network side, but what risk and vulnerabilities do you see when you don't look at the the full, you know, what I would call the triad?
You know, there's the adversaries out there have access to the same technologies that we as protectors of assets have access to. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, some really great sophistication. Most of that stuff is available as a really elegant high-tech solution in the open source marketplace. So it allows access to organizations that don't have a lot of money to spend, and it also allows access to organizations that are out to do nefarious things. The bar to entry is so low now that it's not just nation states that can pull some of these really sophisticated approaches. Organized crime groups, small and mid-sized organized crime groups can now use a lot of that sophistication to attack organizations from areas that traditionally haven't been a viable risk. You know, yeah, it's been a risk, but has it really been a material risk? Because it used to be the long game was only played by the nation state adversaries. It's not the case anymore.
Right.
You know, there's cybercrime organizations who are getting in gingerly to organizations and harvesting over a year or two. You don't see the decades like you do with some of the nation states, but it's a longer term play. So when you add a technology that'll give you visibility into those other threat vectors, specifically those that aren't covered by your traditional stack, you're looking at things from an angle that you've had zero visibility to before. Now, there are technologies that'll allow you to use preventive measures in those technologies, but if you spend much time in high-tech industry,
right,
you really can't play the card of I just need to shut everything down too many times. You know, I've always followed, I heard a quote many years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, from Joe Pescatore Gartner, that, you know, what's the purpose of the brakes on a car? You know, the initial response from most people, or the knee-jerk reaction, well, so you can stop. No, it's not. It's so you can go really fast. Right. You know, the outcome is you can stop, but you want to be able to go fast. So you need brakes. And that's really the role in high tech for cyber, is we're enablers. Right. We need to be able to enable the business. And the way you do that is you have that balance between restrictive technologies, which sometimes you just have to have, and then those where you can monitor and respond quickly enough so that it is as though they are restrictive, but they still give your engineers, your scientists, your researchers that capability to do some crazy stuff. Right. Because that crazy stuff's what drives your pipeline.
Absolutely. Yep. And drives drives the initiatives to be innovative and take risk, but you know, again, do it without harm.
Yeah. Right. Calculated, measured risk.
Yep. So, you know, kind of the last question is what happens if hardware security is ignored? You know, we talked about this earlier, you know, before we started this chat, and you know, if you look at the old days when things were way hard, and the only thing a CISO had to worry about was their IT environment, right? And you know, the chances of a rogue device maybe being, you know, implemented was more of an insider threat, right? But now we've got into the trillions of devices that are inside a network, as we spoke about earlier, the IoT, OT, and IoT infrastructure, and having that visibility for everything that's out there, right? There's the threat vectors have just exponentially, you can't have your eyes everywhere, right? So what do you see as that risk of not putting those resources and time into that hardware space, the hardware layer of security?
Yeah, and I think it has to be hardware and software. You know, I think looking you know, with as mobile a workforce as we have, we can't depend on hardware. It's got to be both.
Yep.
You need both. Unfortunately, we're not where we can depend solely on software yet. Maybe someday, but not today. So having the right technologies at the right point within that stack is critical. You know, there's always going to be those vectors and those approaches that having a nice crunchy layer on the outside, or even if you do tons of micro segmentation on the inside and you can kind of limit the blast radius, there's still going to be a blast. Yes. You want to prevent that blast from beginning. That blast radius is really, okay, well, we failed here, but we saved ourselves here. so you need that layered approach. And that's where solutions where you have, you need those software tools on the endpoints, on your cell phones. That's another huge vector coming in that for years we've taken for granted, cell phones being dropped onto corporate networks. There really wasn't a ton of malware out there. The risks were relatively low. It's not the case anymore.
Right.
That's a thriving market.
Absolutely.
So it's absolutely essential that you have that balanced approach to make sure that you get those varying degree or varying vectors coming in, especially in industries like pharma, life tech, biosciences, that you have things come at you from every different angle.
Yeah,
every different angle.
Absolutely. I think again, we talked about this before, but when you look at this kind of vector, a lot of these tools, you talked about blast ratio and really the kind of attacks that we've seen from companies, and you've seen this in the news also, right? We keep them private. Sometimes you'll see them out in the news, but some of these hardware-based attacks, that whether it be a Raspberry Pi or a Bash Bunny or Rubber Ducky, some of the tools that are out there that a lot of the actual pen testers use, but obviously are sub $100 tools that can be accessed by a bad actor. Having that visibility, obviously, into those devices, and again, as we talked about, the ability to introduce them. Do you see that as those kind of attacks that can happen within pharma also?
Absolutely, and that's nothing new. I think most of pharma, at least big pharma, is aware of those vectors, and they take a lot of precaution. They make a lot of good investments. As you kind of work your way down the stack, the economic maturity stack, it gets a little bit more spotty.
Gotcha.
And you look at the kind of the $1 billion area for pharma, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in that space, because I do believe they've been underserved. And the sophistication, it used to be difficult to program one of those little Bash bunnies to do something that's really harmful. You can program it to do something trivial like change a screensaver.
Right.
But it takes a little bit more sophistication, or at least used to. It doesn't anymore.
Yep.
Now that stuff's all pre-canned in these libraries that are out there that everyone has access to. They just plop it on it and go.
Yeah, but we're kind of seeing that same thing, right? Where the blast ratio, unlike a ransomware, some of the other attacks are not as big, but they're much more the sniper, yeah. Right? So they are very precision attacks. This bad actor knows what they want to do. They have a targeted attack that they're going to come in. It's not, let's see what sticks to the wall. They're either coming in for disruption, stealing of IP, and I think we've been starting to see that. I mean, you look at, Microsoft just announced, this is just so relevant, just announced last week that, hackers backed by Russia, North Korea, targeted COVID-19 vaccine makers. What's your kind of take on that? And where do you see that? You talked a little about nation states before, and we talked about criminals, insider threat. What's your where do you see the biggest threat vectors coming in right now? Yeah,
I think in light of the pandemic that we're kind of in the mid throes of, anytime you have something that generates an emotional response from people, people become the vector. Mm-hmm. Now it kind of harkens back to that insider threat. There's really more than one insider threat.
Right.
There's the human error threat where someone does something just by mistake.
So hygiene, something
right.
like that.
And that's where your blocking and tackling and your awareness training are so critical. But then you have the insider threat because they're pissed off. Right. It's scorched earth. They feel like they were not promoted appropriately, and they just want to break something. That's a real threat. Right. Not a super common one, but it's there. But then you have you can call it corporate espionage, you can call it the nation state threat. I mean, how many researchers have we had in the press in the past year that have been doing bad things and selling stuff to countries or giving stuff to countries that they shouldn't have been?
Sure.
More than one this year. Yep. So it's that happens. And that's people that are harvesting information themselves. When you're talking about, you need to recruit someone to go into an organization at a very entry level, that all they need to do is take this little USB stick in, or this little Raspberry Pi adapter that they just plug into a conference room somewhere and let it do its thing. it becomes attainable. You know,
Right.
It's now in the hands of the nation states, the cyber criminals. Even some of the hacktivist organizations have ramped their game up with using some of this technology just to be disruptive.
Sure. And I think that's part of it too, is like you said, just to be disruptive. I mean, it's really interesting. You hit on a couple topics there, but again, the availability of these tools are very, very easy as we go across. Obviously the disruption to manufacturing is a big one. We talked about visibility and you hit on this, where it's not necessarily a nefarious attack, but it's poor hygiene, right? It's a forgotten tap somewhere or a switch. And now that people aren't physically in some of the data centers all the time, et cetera, how do you reduce that threat landscape? Is like you said, make yourself less porous to attack, and
Right.
and you only do that by visibility. You never want to find out after the fact, right? You like to know the smoke detectors work before the fire starts.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
what about, given COVID and given some of the challenge we've seen around supply chain, right? And people having to go outside their comfort zone of where they actually acquire different materials or different things. What about that risk to supply chains? We've seen this in the government with some of the new compliance regulations coming through, but on a manufacturing side of supply chain, of tools coming into the labs, do you see that as a risk or a challenge to be able to, how do you trust but verify, right? That the data or the hardware and machinery that's coming in is something that it is what it is. I mean, we talk about this all the time, and again, we've had past conversations where the only thing worse than sometimes a bad actor is thinking that your good actor is actually good when it is actually a bad actor, right? Because then it goes undetected. You look at them every day, meanwhile, it looks like it's doing the right thing and it's blinking and it's doing everything
Right.
it's supposed to be, but it could be a manipulated mouse with a Raspberry Pi inside, or it could be something that a CCTV camera that looks absolutely fine, but is sending data back outside. So do you see any challenges, or how do you validate that supply chain?
I do, and I think this is where the cohesion between the manufacturing side and the cyber side, this is where that pays off. Manufacturing processes are in place that look at quality and look at the tightness of that supply chain, but it doesn't look at it from the approach necessarily of cyber. So what the most successful organizations, what I've seen them do is, as they marry up those two concepts and those two organizations become partners, you look at the life cycle of the product. In my case, it was always products that we were manufacturing, often through offshore manufacturing institutes,
Right.
3PLs. So as an instrument, be it a mass spec instrument or a genetic assay instrument, as they are getting developed, it could see 3 or 4 different companies.
Right.
And understanding that, it's not like with the Huawei situation, Huawei uses other manufacturers as well. It doesn't have to be Huawei that wants to do something nefarious. It could be anybody in that supply chain.
Absolutely right. And again, this is kind of, we talked about this one earlier too, is some of the challenges around your traditional NAC, right? And the NAC is an important tool for companies to kind of understand what is NAC, network access control, but what happens when something doesn't have a MAC address, right? Or it's been spoofed and it's saying it's not what it says it is. And this is kind of what we talked about, some of those supply chain challenges. So,
yeah. And you look at the way we purchase today. Had a situation at an organization I was with some years ago that we bought 30 USB drives. We needed a bunch of USB drives, so we bought like 30. I think they were like 256, whatever.
Right.
230. We bought a bunch of USB.
The Mac daddies
drives.
back then, right?
Absolutely. And we bought them from eBay, from a reseller that had lots of stars.
Sure.
There was bad stuff on some of those drives.
And we've seen that, right? This is where we talked a little bit about that supply chain of people being forced to go outside their normal channels, right? Because you just need it. And you're not going to get it as quick. And we're so used to having things, tomorrow, next day, whether it be through Amazon or any of our other manufacturers, that it's caused some of that behavior. Well, listen, we're getting close on time. Just one last question is, What would your recommendations be to CISOs right now in the pharma industry and across for protecting their networks in general outside of the normal stacks that they have, the EDRs and the NACs and the SIMs? What would your recommendation be?
You know, as our business models change and as our delivery models for our business change, cyber has to adapt. And I think we're at one of those precipices now. We're at that precipice where things are going to be more remote than they were yesterday. And you know, when we start talking about 10,000 machines coming back in, there won't be 10,000 machines coming back in. There's going to be some portion that is going to stay out there because it makes more sense from a productivity perspective. And this was really an acceleration of a paradigm that was already in play.
Right.
So those machines that do come back, and there will be a bunch of them.
Right.
We have to understand what they're all about.
Yep.
We have to be able to go from being, okay, this is what we were when we were less decentralized. Now we're more decentralized, so we need to reevaluate all of those layers. And where we don't have the same level of control, we have to start looking at technologies that'll give us those perspectives, both software on the endpoints, as well as hardware around our data center, or even the software that's around some of the cloud instances and the software-defined networking. These approaches, we need to adjust our approach to the cyber outcomes we're looking for to where our business is going.
And that brings us kind of full circle we talked about before, right? Where, that challenge, and Dark Reading just had an article, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, about what happens when these people do start coming back and these workers start coming back into the network, whether it be with a corporate-owned asset or their own assets, and how do you validate that, what has been done while they're out? Again, they're not security experts, wasn't maybe nefarious, things that were done by them, but how do you make sure that you're now at that, that zero trust models we talk about as they come back in? So, well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for the time today and taking the time, and I look forward to having more of these discussions as we move forward. I think, from there, I think I want to be conscious of time with the video, but, great questions from the audience. And again, I hope you and your family have a happy holiday.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
You too, Jay.